The first successful British colony in what would become the United States was the Jamestown colony in 1607. 12 years later, the first enslaved people from Africa arrived on the shores of Virginia. The foundations of the United States economy and society was built on American Indian land by African and European hands. The physical, intellectual, and spiritual labor of Black folks has shaped the United States throughout its history and will continue to do so long into the future. It is important to understand slavery as it was practiced in the United States in order to understand the cultural, spiritual, social, and political environment that we live in today. In this video, we are going to be discussing the question, what consequences did the practice of slavery have on the United States? There's a lot to unpack, so let's get started. The Americas had a lot of things that Europeans wanted: gold, silver, furs, tobacco, sugarcane, indigo, and much more. Many of these items needed intense physical labor in order to get them out of the ground or to make them profitable. European landowners in the Americas needed cheap labor, and they found it in Africa. Europeans destabilized West and Central Africa by trading goods, arms, and alcohol for people. Africans who lived on the West Coast traveled into the interior of the continent and captured others. They targeted young men and women, leaving behind the elderly and less able. Then these young people were marched hundreds of miles to the West African coast. It is estimated that roughly half of the 20 million people taken from the interior of the African continent died on the grueling march to the coast. After making it to the coast, the captives were sold to European and American merchants. Merchants deliberately bought people who were from different ethnic groups because that way these culturally and linguistically distinct people wouldn't be able to easily communicate with each other and were therefore less likely to be able to escape or overthrow the crew of the ship. Africans were packed into the holds of the ships with little space for movement and little ability to maintain hygiene. Often, Africans were chained together or to the ship, eating and defecating in the same space for a voyage that would last anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks. Diseases, despair, and death were constant companions. Between 10 and 20%, or between 1 and 2.2 million Africans packed into the dark, airless ship holds died before making it to the Americas. For a first-hand account of what this was like, I recommend reading the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, written by himself. At first, colonists were not sure how to treat enslaved Africans. In some places, enslaved Africans were treated the same as white indentured servants and able to have the same rewards if they completed their term of service. This meant that some Black folks gained their freedom and were given land in some of the northern colonies. It didn't take long, however, for slavery to turn into something much more institutionalized, much more brutal, and much more inhumane. Stemming from racism and perceived threats to colonists' wealth, colonists began instituting a system called chattel slavery. They adopted and adapted this system from plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, where slave labor was used to create unimagined wealth for those few who could afford land and enslaved people. In the system of chattel slavery, children who were born to a woman who was enslaved inherited her enslaved status. Generations of Black folks who were born enslaved, worked as enslaved people, and died without ever being able to experience freedom. Enslaved people could not decide where they lived, could not choose what type of work they would do, could not own any property, could not go to school, and could not legally marry. Slavery carried an especially heavy weight on women who were often victims of sexual abuse and harassment. Women were also expected to work while birthing as many children as possible. After all, enslaved children would grow up to be workers or sold for capital. Resistance to slavery often began as soon as a person was enslaved. Escape attempts were common, although often unsuccessful and deadly. Many enslaved people chose to resist in understated ways. They did not attempt armed rebellions, but resisted in any way they could think to inconvenience their owners or to make their own lives more bearable. For the sake of this video, we are going to call this passive resistance, though it is important to note that these actions were strategic, carried out with courage, and involved no small amount of risk. Aboard the Middle Passage, resistance could take many forms, including choosing not to eat and jumping into the ocean. Often, enslaved people chose starving and drowning instead of living life as a slave. Enslaved people would continue to choose to die rather than continue living in slavery throughout slavery's long history in the United States. There were many types of passive resistance that enslaved people chose to use all the way until they were freed by the Union Army after the Civil War. Many people took comfort in spirituality, often a mix of Christianity and ethnic traditions carried across the waves from Africa. For many enslaved people, the parallels between Bible stories in which the Jews were enslaved and their own enslavement were obvious. Enslaved people combined African-style chants and singing with Christian hymns, resulting in spirituals, the first distinctly American music. Other forms of passive resistance were the breaking of equipment and refusing to work. These types of resistance were dangerous, as overseers and masters often punished enslaved people by withholding food and water, with beatings, whippings, and by being sold. Enslaved people ran away from these brutal conditions all the time. Men were hired to track down these runaway or fugitive slaves. Many enslaved people attempted to escape north into states that had laws against slavery, or later into Canada. There were people who helped escapees make their way north, most notably Harriet Tubman, who was an escaped slave herself. Tubman made the dangerous journey south many times in order to help those who needed her. She and other escapees would have been punished severely if they had been caught. Typical punishments for attempting to escape were to cut off a toe, break an ankle, or sell the person to another plantation. All of these punishments served two purposes. First, to make it more difficult for the enslaved person to try and escape a second time, and second, to serve as a warning to other enslaved people. Don't even try it.
Go down to Nineveh and serve my Lord.
In the slaveholding South for most of the 1700s, tobacco was the most profitable crop that was grown and harvested by the labor of enslaved people. Cotton, which had always grown in the region, was another crop that was grown and harvested mainly through slave labor, although for a long time it just wasn't that profitable. Cotton was picky and difficult to grow. To pick cotton, a worker would have to pull the fluffy white lint from the boll, trying not to cut his or her hands on the sharp ends. The average cotton plant was less than 3 feet high, so many workers had to bend over and pick the cotton. As they picked, they would place the lint in burlap sacks carried on their backs. So not only would the worker have to pick the cotton, they would then have to drag the bag along with him as well. In a typical day, a good worker could pick 300 pounds of cotton or more, meaning that in any given day, a typical picker would carry a substantial amount of weight, even if they had emptied the sack many times. Picking the seeds out of the cotton was a tedious process, similar to picking burrs out of a sweater. After the days and hours of manually picking cotton, enslaved people would then spend hours and days picking seeds out of the hundreds of pounds of cotton that they had picked. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin to help reduce the labor of removing the seeds from cotton. It was enormously successful. As Whitney said, 1 man and a horse will do more than 50 men. Because of how successful the invention was, it quickly spread around the South, and many farmers and plantation owners who hadn't ever considered cotton now decided that cotton was the easiest way to turn a profit. Because the cotton gin made cotton easier to process, it made planters wealthier, which made them plant more cotton, which needed more enslaved people to grow and pick it. The invention of the cotton gin exploded the need for slave labor. Slavery, which had actually begun to decrease, rose sharply after the integration of cotton gin into the industry. Cotton was king. 32% of white families owned enslaved people in the southern states. This ranged from 20% of white families in Arkansas to 49% of white families in Mississippi that owned enslaved people. Even though the majority of white families in the South did not own slaves, slavery as an institution and a cultural practice was a foundational belief to many Southerners. Many white men aspired to work their way up in society and be able to own enslaved people themselves. Even those who knew that they would never have a chance defended the system of slavery as with slavery intact, no matter how poor or destitute a white man was, at least he was better than enslaved people on the social ladder. Just because passive resistance was much more common did not mean that enslaved people and free people alike did not participate in armed resistance to the institution of slavery. 65 of these revolts were recorded, and there may be others which were not. 3 of the most well-known slave rebellions were led by Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. Gabriel Prosser, along with his brother Solomon, organized one of the biggest slave revolts in American history. They grew up learning how to read and write, which was extremely uncommon in their home state of Virginia. They were also trained as blacksmiths, which came in handy for when they were forging weapons for their followers and aided in their rebellion. Before Gabriel and the other organizers could begin the revolt, 2 men leaked the plans, and most of the people involved in the plot were arrested. Gabriel was executed along with a number of his conspirators on October 10th of 1800. Denmark Vesey was born enslaved and was one of very few enslaved people who was able to win his freedom. He set up a carpentry shop in Charleston, South Carolina, and in 1822 planned to kill all of the white slave owners in Charleston and free all of the enslaved people who lived there. Eventually, Denmark and his co-conspirators planned to steal a ship and leave Charleston with all of the formerly enslaved people and go to Haiti, where in 1791 there was a successful slave-led revolution. Before the plan could be implemented, Denmark and his co-conspirators were found out and were executed by hanging. Nat Turner was born as an enslaved person in Virginia. Nat was extremely religious and had visions in which the spirit communicated with him. Nat devoted himself to the visions that the Spirit gave him, in which he interpreted as messages to rise up against slavery and slay my enemies with their own weapons. On August 13th, Nat and 6 men began the work of killing white people, beginning with the family who owned him, the Travises. By August 22nd, Nat and 40 enslaved people as part of his force had together killed 55 white people. In the end, Nat's forces were scattered by a white militia, and 55 enslaved people were executed. Nat's rebellion sparked enormous amounts of fear in Virginia, and in the months after, almost 200 black people were murdered by mobs of white people. Enslaved people had no recourse in the courts. They were legally seen as property, not people or citizens, and therefore could not bring any grievances against the people who mistreated them. Frustrated, degraded, but still hopeful, enslaved people took what action they could, whether that be refusing to work, attempting to escape, or arming themselves to take their freedom by force. Abolitionism began with Quaker communities in the northern colonies and spread throughout the entire country. As southern states came to depend financially and culturally on slavery to an ever-expanding degree, most abolitionist organizations became based in the North. Both white and black people flocked to abolitionist groups to help end slavery. One of the ironies, however, is that while some white abolitionists, while passionate about ending slavery, still did not believe nor want black people to be their equal. One of the most unusual things about abolitionist organizations was the prevalence of female organizers and speakers. Women, who were not allowed to vote and were not encouraged to have opinions on politics, found an arena where they could push for social change. This is the first social and political movement that women would make enormous contributions to, shortly followed by the women's suffrage movement and the temperance movement. Abolitionists, white and black, female and male, rich and poor, fought for decades to abolish slavery, but it would take until the fighting of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to give African Americans citizenship in a real and meaningful way. Abolitionists learned many skills while campaigning for the end of slavery, skills that they would use to apply to other movements for social and political justice, including the temperance movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement. The legacy of abolitionism still lives on. Before then President-elect Lincoln was ever inaugurated, South Carolina became the first state to leave the United States, stating in their Articles of Secession that President-elect Lincoln's opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Other states would follow, and most would either mention that the protection of slavery was why they were leaving, or they indirectly referenced slavery by claiming that they were leaving the Union to protect their property and their way of life. Some called it their peculiar institution. Perhaps the most explicit example comes from Texas's Articles of Secession, which reads that it was seceding based upon the unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, claiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men irrespective of their race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind and in violation of the plainest revelations of the divine law. While President Abraham Lincoln did not believe in slavery and in fact considered himself an abolitionist, he did not fight the Civil War over slavery. He fought to keep the United States together. As he said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others, I would also do that." So began the deadliest war in American history, a grueling, brutal fight claiming the lives of over 620,000 people over the course of 4 years, and ending with 3,953,760 freed people, shortly thereafter to become citizens of the country they helped to build.